Oh, dang it, that's we're live.
All four people. All right, so is everybody gonna be able to like chime in, or do you just like mute everybody?
They are automatically muted, and
Oh.
then we can have Q&A in the chat.
Cool, right on.
But when it's a small enough group, I like when people like pop in.
Oh, hi, Ruda and Adam.
Hey, how's it?
Oh,
Let me get my video
yeah.
going here.
Right on.
Hello.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Doré.
Hi.
All right. So since we're live, and since we're live on here, and we're live on Facebook, and it's 4:59. Let me know when we want to get started.
Oh, that's pretty good audio for being on a sailboat. Look at that, such a steady camera. Wow, amazing.
Adam, amazing.
I got
So if
Noah
you guys-
Thompson in the back steering, so just tell Noah keep them straight. Hey, Doré, how are you?
Good. Just, you know, going through the global systemic issues. Are you taking a break from HPU?
No, full speed ahead with summer. Summer classes, some directed studies, so no stopping.
Cool. Lauren,
All
I think we
right.
can get started.
All right, that's what I was going to say. Okay. All right, aloha everybody. My name is Lauren Blickley. I am the Hawaii Regional Manager with Surfrider Foundation. I started, I guess, in March 1st, and then we had a global pandemic. So it's been a fun couple of months in this position, and getting to work with Doré very closely, and very excited that we can bring this event to you guys, and having such an incredible panel of speakers this evening to really dive into the story of plastic. And this documentary, which really did honestly take a deeper dive than probably any of the documentaries that have been published thus far on the plastic pollution issue, and taking it to, I think, levels that people haven't necessarily thought about before. The plastics issue has obviously grown over the past couple of decades, but we're focused a lot on things like ban the straw, ban the bag, right, which have their place and their time and have been really important. But this really started diving into these connections between our plastic pollution issue, the oil industry, poverty, social justice issues, and a lot of other things, that intimidation factors, pulling the blind eye over consumers, lying to consumers, right? And really getting at some of these deeper issues. So thank you guys for joining us this evening, and our amazing panel that we have. I'm going to introduce you guys first, and then we'll get started with their stories. So tonight we have Kahi Picaro, who is the co-founder of Sustainable Coastlines, and he is now the director of Parlay Hawaii. We have Marissa Miller, who is representing our youth voice. Woo woo, go Marissa. And she is the president of the Cal Poly Surfrider Club. Good job. And then we also have Doré Shin, who is our chapter coordinator of the Oahu Surfrider Foundation chapter. And I want to start with you, Kahi, and because this is a whole story of plastic, telling your story, each one of you sharing your stories, because there's a reason why all of us are here tonight, and that's because we all have a personal connection with plastic pollution, and we've all gotten involved in this topic from a lot of different perspectives. So Kahi, start us off with your story. How did you get involved? Why plastic?
Well, first off, thank you, Lauren and Surfrider, for this opportunity to be here. So from my story, if you were to ask me 15 years ago if I thought I'd be here, I would say, hell no. I was into real estate development and was really focused on financial arbitrage as it's related to financing big deals around real estate. So the environment wasn't really something I even thought about. So I think what's really a cool takeaway is that you could be one place in in one part of your life and quickly make a 180 to fully change who you are. And it really takes some type of life-changing experience for that to happen. And for me, it was just seeing the problem firsthand and then making that connection that I was the problem. And then realizing that if I wanted to provide a future of Hawaii that I was lucky enough to grow up in, that things had to change. So I started Sustainable Coastlines Hawaii with 7 other friends. We pitched in $50, hosted our first cleanup in late 2010. And to that point, like, I had really only been to, I think, only one other beach cleanup in my life. So I didn't have much experience. All I knew was that the cleanup I went to was really, really fun. There was beer, and there was a band. So I was like, okay, how do we replicate that? And so we did, except for the beer at the beach. We did that later. So we made the beach cleanups fun. We had over 200 people show up to the very first one. And the number one question was, when is the next cleanup? So we just parlayed our success on the first one. And 10 years later, Sustainable Coastlines Hawaii remains one of the biggest cleanup groups in the state and also one of the biggest in the world. So I'd say like that where I am today right now, I'm extremely grateful. Everything that happened to me prior led me to this point, but I would have never guessed that I would be here as a result of my past.
Thank you, Kahi. I don't think I realized that. Look, see where we get when we tell each other stories. And I think, I agree. It's interesting where we end up. And every time I tried to make a 10-year plan and it gets that 10 years, I'm never at that plan, but it was a good plan when I had it. So Marissa, what's your story? Why plastic pollution? How did you get here?
Hi. Yeah, thanks for having me as well. I got pretty interested in this whole issue when I was pretty young, I think before I could really understand it. My parents told me that we went camping when I was in like 2nd grade, and I vaguely remember this, but they were like, yeah, you went down to the beach and you were really surprised by all of the trash that was on the beach and you started picking it all up. And apparently I had like rallied all of my siblings and their friends who were camping with us to like come down to the beach and like come pick up all of this trash that was like floating in with the tides. And I was asking so many questions and just really like surprised by what I was seeing and witnessing, because it just like more kept washing up with every wave. And I think that really like stuck with me from a really young age. And around the same time, Jack Johnson actually visited our school and came to like do a little mini concert and talk a little bit about sustainability issues for Kukua Foundation. And I think that was kind of like the beginning for me, and that planted the seeds of all of these like issues in my mind. And throughout my education, I was fortunate enough to learn a lot more about these problems and experience them firsthand, like Kahi was saying, and also just meet a lot of really inspiring people who are doing great work that encouraged me to continue to be involved in it. And I had the opportunity to start a club while I was in high school, and then now lead the Cal Poly Club for Surfrider. So just kind of accumulation of events over time, and a lot of encounters with really inspiring people who are doing great work that just kind of like really pulled me in to be involved in the issue and in solving it.
Thank you, Marissa. And I do want to circle back to that in a little bit, talking about when I was a kid in the 80s and 90s, we'd go to the beach with my parents and we wouldn't pick up trash. We didn't do it. It wasn't there. And I think that's a really important point that definitely circle back on with this generation today. Your generation and the generation that's going to come after, like they're growing up with more plastic than sand and crabs and everything else that you're supposed to find on your beach, and just what that looks like and how that shifts the narrative as well. So we're really thankful to have your voice here, your youth vote, your youth voice, all of us oldie moldies over here. We've been in this too long. And then finally, Duration, can you share with us why plastic pollution, why you're here, how you got involved with this?
Yeah, so a lot of people think I'm local just because I'm tan and Asian, but I'm actually from Pennsylvania, and I'm born and raised in kind of the greater Philadelphia area. And I think being so far from nature, I mean, it was like 3 or 4 hours to the closest beach. I never really was exposed to environmental issues or like a deep love or connection to nature. And I think the only environmental thing I remember when I was a kid was we grew up kind of poor. And so we would buy napkins and cut them in half, like paper napkins, and like fold them and cut them in half just to like save money. But it was also like a conservation thing. But yeah, so that was like really my only exposure. But when I moved to Hawaii in 2010, I really fell in love with nature, and it was quite immediate and profound. And from this place where I realized how important nature was and how healing it was to be in the presence of nature and the ocean, it was juxtaposed with this exposure to immense amounts of plastic and styrofoam I was seeing on the UH campus where I was a freshman. And it really felt like it didn't make sense to me. It was like too paradoxical that these two things were happening, this beautiful nature and then this deep disconnect where there was all this litter everywhere. And so I kind of decided to switch my major from political science to sustainability studies pretty early on, and focus all my energy on climate and environmental issues and solutions. And got involved with, I found the Surfrider UH Club, they were drinking beers at the campus bar, and convinced them to try to ban styrofoam because that was the thing I was seeing more than anything. And I hadn't even gone to my first beach cleanup at that point, but during the campaign where we were trying to ban styrofoam at UH, I went to a Surfrider cleanup at Magic Island, and I picked up so many plastic bags and forks and wrappers and water bottles, things that I was still using on a daily basis. And that's really when it clicked for me that I was part of the problem too, that instead of pointing fingers, that I needed to change my own life, and get involved in a more authentic way by changing how I live my life, and in that way, how I present myself as an activist. So that's really what got me started in the environmental movement.
Thank you, Duray. I will say, I feel like you are very authentic when it comes to walking the walk. And it's interesting, you moved here and started sort of finding that love for nature right as Kahi was having fun at beach cleanup. So interesting sort of overlap. And I'm glad that you touched on that. So Kahi, Duray, and I think we first met in 2016. We're part of the Hawaii Marine Debris Action Planning, which isn't as much fun as it sounds. But it's a really good process, and creating, these plans and these actions for addressing plastic pollution on our shorelines. I got my personal start in plastic pollution because at the time I was working for a nonprofit who focused on marine mammals and essentially saving the whales. And as the outreach coordinator and conservation manager, I didn't know how to connect that issue to the general public. I mean, they come and they see whales and it's that immediate moment, but how do you really save the whales? And it was around the time we were trying to pass our tobacco-free beaches and parks bill. And I was like, plastic pollution, that's our number one issue impacting a lot of these animals, like direct impact, right, outside of climate change, which is all connected. And so I started doing beach cleanups and some small research studies on the island of Maui. And then once getting a part of this bigger hui, just realizing kind of what you were saying, Duray, it's like, oh my gosh, plastics is such an issue that's directly connected to the consumer. I can literally refuse a straw or refuse a fork or change the packaging or buy in bulk. I can do all of these things immediate and see such an immediate impact. And that was something for me where it was just like, this is a no-brainer. And getting into, hopefully we'll have time tonight in this discussion to get into some of those, we'll get into some of those action items. For those of you who are joining us, there is the chat box. So if you're joining us on Zoom, you can chat on Zoom, and you can also since we're Facebook Live, you can post a comment and I'll try to grab it there if you have some questions. But the first thing I want to dive into is specifically just taking a moment, to recognize the fact that racial and social justice issues are at our collective forefront right now, and rightly so. And this particular documentary did take an opportunity to dive into that. And so also, instead of just looking at plastic pollution from Westernized and from a mainland and United States perspective, it really took us through the entire journey of plastic from beginning to end. And before everyone jumped on, we were having a conversation, and I want to start this off with Kahi, because one of the things that this particular documentary brought up is these marginalized communities are the ones who are bearing the burden of plastic pollution. So Kahi, you had some good thoughts and just good discussion. I want to turn it over to you because you've also been directly involved with some of these communities and visited them. So I was wondering if you could sort of speak to that and how this burden of plastic is so heavy on these marginalized communities, and how there's this intersect between the environmental and racial justice issues.
Right on. Well, thanks for that question. I think what the first thing that we're having a reckoning with is the fact that environmentalism hasn't taken enough focus on the social justice side of things. And like, without social justice, we don't really have a true environmental movement. And this documentary, like, it really helped shed light on that problem, where you've got like the refineries in underserved communities, you've got the recycling facilities in the places with the lowest wages and like minimal if or zero environmental protection agencies. When we talk about how we get people to care about plastics, right? Like, you got to find the right angles. Like, some people don't care about the dolphins or the whales or the turtles, right? Some people don't care about anything other than themselves, and then it's a health issue. It's like, hey, you're affecting your own health. And then there's some that are like, actually just don't care about either, but are more empathetic towards others. And I think that was a really cool angle for us to really focus on, and that didn't really get much attention at all in the past in documentaries. And I'd be more than willing to bet that the next video that comes out by these producers will really pour more attention on the social construct of our use of plastics, and how it's a continual version of colonialization and the burden it's taking on people that are marginalized, and that's people of color. So that was kind of like, I wasn't quite exactly what we were talking about earlier, but I was really excited to see that was such a new part of the conversation that I've recognized around the world through my work and just surfing. But it was refreshing to see others bringing it to light, and it's not just about the turtle with a straw in his nose.
And I think that's a really good point, right? Because where we've seen, I'd say US mainland based in terms of raising awareness about the plastic pollution, turtle in its nose has been very important to raise and pull and tug at heartstrings. But banning plastic bags, banning plastic straws, these really specific consumer items that most of us, I'd venture to say, who are tuning in and watching this have done, right? We've taken that step. And I think you're right that this is going so much deeper and showing how they're specifically marketing and specifically creating products, right, to target at these low income, these poverty stricken areas. So you are buying toothpaste in single use, you are buying shampoo in single use in these sachets. And I was wondering if you could just touch really quick, because I think you were one of the first that I heard. I was like, oh yeah, I've got all my reusables, and you were like, it's packaging, and I was like, oh. So, just kind of speaking to that packaging piece for a second.
Well, I always like I get pulled into these conversations a lot, and when people start caring, they first fall into the basic tropes of plastic pollution advocacy, and that's like the island the size of Texas. That's a trash island, and then it's we should just ban all single-use plastics, and that's going to solve our problems. And then it's not us. It's those 5 Asian countries that contribute 90% of the trash in the ocean. And you're like, wait, don't you realize that they're making our stuff, and then we're trying to sell them our stuff in smaller packaging because they can't afford such a big bottle? Like this problem is coming out of those countries, but those companies that are making that trash are our Western companies. So the packaging is a major issue, but it's beyond packaging. Like, if we want to get to the root of the problem, it's those in the boardroom, it's those holding stock in those companies, and it's this construct that we always need these short-term gains and shareholder returns, that we're stuck in this vicious cycle of continuing trying to get bigger margins and better return for the shareholders at the expense of the environment and people. So we have what we're going through right now with BLM is relevant, and it's like all linked together. And I hope that more of us start understanding that we're not going to solve this problem by banning a straw. It's so much bigger. And to me, it really gets down to the crux of removing, corporate influence on our elections and on our politicians.
Thank you. You always speak such good truths, Kahi. And thinking about that, one of the biggest things when you're in this plastic pollution issue is this people versus product, right? And it's not a product issue, it's how people deal with the product at the end. So one of the things, and Dore, I want to turn this over to you, is this whole idea behind recycling, incineration, and Oahu does utilize incineration. So I just wanted you to speak to that a little bit and maybe clarify some things and speak to the fact that the incineration, this waste to energy, that they put this beautiful, lovely, nice label on it, but what is the reality behind that?
Yeah, that's so important, because I think we all fall victim to that when we first get involved in these issues, because that's all we're hearing. And I think we all really have to be cognizant of how brainwashed we all become just by inheriting the system that we inherit. And if you follow the money to where this narrative around don't litter, just recycle, those are the 2 only action items you ever need to think about. That narrative comes from companies like Coca-Cola and Pepsi and Unilever. These are the companies pumping out single-use plastics at such extraordinary rates that they have so much money to pump into false advertising campaigns that put all the responsibility on the consumer to just not litter and to just recycle. And don't look at us, the ones who are giving you no other options. And so that's why you also see these companies associated with and advocating for incineration and recycling as a main focus around this issue. And so if you just look at that, and then you look at this fact that, and this is something that I learned from Nicole Chatterson, the director of Zero Waste Oahu, this concept of the wasteberg. So if you think about an iceberg where you can't actually see most of the iceberg, all you're seeing is the very tip. It's the same with waste, and the actual statistic that researchers have found is that for every 1 pound of trash or plastic that we throw away, like a bottle, there's 70 pounds of trash upstream that were produced and wasted that we can't even see. That just the water, the transportation, the oil, all the stuff required in extracting, producing, and transporting that piece of material to you. So I think it's so important to move away from pointing fingers at each other, blaming each other for using one piece of plastic, and really going back to where are these things coming from? What are the companies that are responsible, that are trying to have us pitted against each other as individuals? Because if we tackle the companies, we're gonna be able to solve these problems at such a faster rate than if we just continue to blame consumers and try to change one straw at a time. So it really is bigger than that. And I think that also connects to Bill 40, which I'm sure we'll talk about. And any effort to pass the plastic legislation anywhere in the world, you have the same industry lobbyists from American Chemistry Council, American Beverage Association, the Food Industry Association, the Restaurant Associations. It's always the same people that are against real policy change. And so it always does, like Kahi said, go back to our system of capitalism that's uncontrolled and unregulated. And I really think that goes at the root of the problem, and that will also tackle racial injustice and all the other intersectional issues that our world is facing. So I always feel like money and politics is always the foundation of everything.
And Marissa, before I get to you, I want to pick up on something Doray was just talking about, which were the bills and the American Chemistry Council, right? What was really interesting is here on Maui in 2012, we passed the Tobacco-Free Beaches and Parks bill to try to address cigarette butts, right? And cigarette butt litter, plastic, number one plastic littered. And that went through our county council in about like 4 months. Like it was really fast. And I was like, great, I love this. So like, I love policy. This is so fun. And look, we're making all these changes. So a couple months later, we tried to pass our polystyrene bill, and that came up. And that took us, I mean, it had been off and on, so probably a total of 10 years. But from 2012, it took us at least 4 years to get that passed, because here I was, like, the cigarette and tobacco lobbyists didn't come out and try to ban our tobacco ban. But all of a sudden, I'm standing up there getting ready to talk about polystyrene, why we should ban this, thinking we're going to get it banned. And this one guy walks into one of our meetings and says, hey, I'm Tom from the American Chemistry Council. And I think that's when it hit me that, oh God, they've got, like, American Chemistry Council is here on Maui fighting our local bills. Like, we're on their radar now. I think that's when this issue got so much bigger for me. And the money, the power, the intimidation, right, that they have surrounding all of this. And to have, and oh, Tom also mentioned that he was from California. So here they are flying in lobbyists to our islands to dictate what we're doing. And that was a whole new avenue for me. And again, to really see how this is so much bigger than me or this one bill. And I think that was I'm glad they brought that up in this documentary, the intimidation factor. Kahi, Doray, Marissa, this one's kind of open to all of you, but I am interested, not that I was ever getting death threats or anything like that, but just again, to see the power and the level that they were coming at, and the sophistication and the arguments they had, and how they were able to so manipulate it because they're professionals at this. So just curious if you guys had any experiences with sort of that level of the power too, because that's kind of what we're talking about right now, is that politics and power and money, and it goes back to oil, right? So I'm going to just open it up to you guys.
Okay, well, I can speak specifically to the American Chemistry Council. I actually went to a conference once that was for the plastics industry, and I showed up with 2 buckets of microplastic that we'd picked up off of Kailua Beach, and more or less made myself known that I was the I guess the person that probably shouldn't be there to create a bit of a tussle and make my voice be heard. And if you want to shut me up, you got to kick me out. But you know, they actually listened. And the guy that's in that video, in the movie, he's the VP of the American Chemistry Council for plastics. Steve, I think was his name. We actually went and had some beers with him. And what they more or less were saying is that everything we're saying is correct, but they have a set of clients. You know, they represent their clients and their clients' interests in continuing to make the amounts of money or not, or more money than they're already making. And the success of the American Chemistry Council is based on making sure that the money keeps flowing. So what Hawaii represented, I was like, why do you care about Hawaii? We're a tiny little state in the middle of the ocean. Our consumers are such a drop in the bucket. It makes no difference to you. Why are you spending the money in Hawaii to try to block these bills? And the reasoning they said was, well, it's a slippery slope. We can't afford the momentum. We can't have you guys pass something and then all of a sudden other places think that they can pass something. And that was, I was like, oh, geez, I really hadn't thought about it that way. I should have, but I get it. It does, like, I get it. I appreciate your honesty. And then I made him pay for the beers. So that, like, these people, they're humans, you know, maybe they don't have as much of a empathetic soul, but I try to reason with their thinking, and it's challenging to do so. But in the end, they're trying to put maybe better food and lots more of it on their plate than others. But they're looking out for their own survival and the survival of their clients. So I have met with the American Chemistry Council and a bunch of the other organizations that push for this type of stuff. I've even had tussles with the Ocean Conservancy and the Keep America Beautiful campaigns and the Keep Hawaii Beautiful campaigns. So I was never afraid. I was at first, but I was inspired by this guy, Steve Wilson. He was actually the co-director of The Story of Plastic. This was pretty much his project. So the movie that we watched, we can thank Steve for this. And I witnessed his activism in Jamaica at a UN conference when he, in the middle of a conference, just stood up on his chair. And he's a big boy. Like, this isn't like, these are these like conference chairs, and I was afraid he was going to break it. And he just like started yelling at the top of his lungs, talking about, why aren't we talking about the big issue here, and the fact that this whole conference is being funded by the people we as environmentalists are saying we need to shut down. We can't get our narrative through because you guys are taking money from the same people we are saying are the problem. So I guess going back to the question, it's like the American Chemistry Council and these other organizations are willing to talk and negotiate to a certain extent. But in order to dismantle what they're trying to do, we can't alienate them. We actually have to engage with them to a certain extent to try to understand where they're coming from and find the weaknesses in order to exploit them and get our mission completed.
Thank you, Kahi. And this is why I always appreciate conversations with you, because you just got such great insight. Dore, were you gonna add on?
I just wanted to tag on to say I'm glad that guy paid for your beers, because all these lobbyists make six figures. And I actually was in a private conversation once with one of the major lobbyists here, who is usually, you know, an opposing force for the things that we fight for. And she told me privately that she can't let go of her salary, and that she agreed with everything I said, like Kahi mentioned, around what's important, but that there were so many things that we could find alignment on, but that she couldn't publicly say that she supported them. But in private, she said, yeah, I definitely would support that. I just can't, I'm not allowed to say that in public. And so it is important to realize that these people are taking high paying jobs to advocate for things that they often don't 100% align with. And not only that, but they're also some of the top campaign contributors for local and national politicians, and that these politicians are in bed with these lobbyists. And so we have to address that level of corruption, because when we fight for bills, I mean, I heard that 13 years ago, they were fighting for a styrofoam ban, and we weren't able to pass anything until this year, Bill 40. So that's 13 years of failure. And every time I was in those rooms when I first got involved, I was so upset every time because it'd always be like 50 to 100 people packing the room, youth and adults and families crying and upset about the plastic issue and that we need to address this, we support this bill, and one lobbyist, sometimes two, that are like, we oppose this bill for these reasons, and just speaking the way that they speak, and then the bill would die. And so the power of the people is completely lost in the fog of corporate influence. And so that's something that I really feel is important, that we not only elect people that are promising to not be bought out by money, but that we are able to see that influence clearly and try to break through that as much as possible.
Thank you, Doray. I saw Kahi, if you had something quick to add on, and then I was going to jump to Marissa.
I never had a helicopter land in my yard and kill my dog. How gnarly was that? That was heavy. That was freaking heavy. But you know, those lobbyists are doing similar things in not to us, but to the politicians that they elected. Like, if you want your job, this is what you have to do. It's all in the back rooms. They're just having these conversations and be like, we're going to get you reelected. You just got to do this. You got to squash this bill. And they've been doing that for decades. So yeah, that was gnarly in the movie when she said that. I was like, what? Whoa, heavy.
That was really heavy, and she was in Texas too. So it was interesting because I feel like it sort of backfired on Maui when they had the American Chemistry Council come out, because all of a sudden our county council is kind of like, who are you, Tom from California? Why are you coming in here and telling us how we're supposed to run our island? So I thought that was interesting because he did provide the local backlash against the bill with ammo, and I think made it drag out longer, like a couple years longer than it should have. But I think in the end, at least in the county council we had at the time, they were able to see through that. So yeah, I guess if they're going to come lobby in Hawaii, hopefully they're not watching this and they don't know our tactics. But Marissa, I wanted to turn it over to you a little bit because you grew up in Hawaii, born and raised, and now have been in California. And just curious a little bit about that shift and that perspective, not only from a beach cleanup perspective and what you're finding on the beach, but also, you know, kind of not necessarily that you've gotten into a lot of the politics of it, but just the mindset. I mean, what, I guess just tell us what you've seen and feel and how that's been a little different, or if there are any differences.
Yeah, I saw in the chat box that Christian was asking about my interaction with like lobbyists or school administrators and stuff, and kind of tagging on this conversation that's been happening around the resistance of like industry and lobbyists for the industry. There's a really interesting documentary called The Merchants of Doubt that kind of breaks down the tactics used by the tobacco and the fossil fuel industry and how they spread misinformation in order to keep basically making profit off of all of these externalities that are affecting marginalized communities and all of us. So that's just a really interesting documentary that if anyone wants to check that out. But speaking more on the question you just asked, I think there's a really interesting dynamic depending on where you are about people's perceptions of this plastic issue, because obviously there are communities that are directly impacted by it that we saw in the film, that are impacted by it on a level way beyond what we can even comprehend growing up here in Hawaii, obviously. But also like just the difference between here and California that I've noticed growing up here, like as I mentioned, I saw like direct issues of plastic pollution and marine debris floating up on our beaches. On the east side, if you go over there, like it's all you see, it's all over the place and it's in massive quantities and it's hard to ignore. But in California, it's a little bit of a different story. And I've noticed that through my involvement in organizing beach cleanups here versus there, it's kind of harder to bring people to the awareness of how systemic the issue is and how it's a bigger problem than just littering, which is kind of what the film is touching on, that the problem is in the whole supply chain. And you can make that connection pretty easily here if you go to a beach cleanup and you pay attention to what you're seeing, and that the plastic is coming from all over the world and it's accumulating in these gyres and it's floating up on our shores, and it's not just a litter problem. But in California, most of the stuff that we find at our beach cleanups is litter. So it's really interesting just seeing people's perspectives of the issue depending on where they're coming from and what they've directly experienced, and trying to bring people to a new awareness and draw connections between different aspects of the problem by educating them and talking to them about the issue. So that's been like an interesting experience looking at involvement in this movement from two different places.
And you touch on cleanups, and that was something that we were also talking about before, and that this particular documentary sort of touched on. But I want to dive into this discussion of beach cleanups a little bit, because Kahi's coming from a place where he launched an organization that was 100% around these massive cleanups. Dore and Oahu chapter, the cleanups are big cleanups, they're big events. I know, Marissa, you were saying that you organize cleanups with your student chapter. So cleanups are obviously a critical part of this, but the documentary was also so much of it, I think, I shouldn't say documentary, so much of what we do now is focused on that cleanup, right? It's focused on banning straws and picking it up. So I would like to open this to each of you, and it doesn't matter who, maybe Marissa, since you're on it and talking, what is the role of beach cleanups? Because I felt like this particular documentary didn't dive into it as much. We know there's some challenges with cleanups, but what do you think the role of cleanups are? How do they play into this?
Yeah, I think beach cleanups are really important. It's usually how most people get involved in this movement in the first place. Everyone I know who's involved in this movement started with beach cleanups because it's the most tangible way to take action, and it gets people interested because they get to go out there and spend time by the ocean with friends and community members and learn about the problem firsthand. And although it's not necessarily the solution to any of this, by no means, but it is really important because I think people need to draw a connection to these before they can really care about them and really dedicate time to solving them, or at least addressing them in any way. So I think beach cleanups are a great way for people to learn a little bit more about it, get educated, and also get connected and plugged into their community and the people who are working on these issues and addressing them in a more systemic way and in a more proactive way. Because without showing up to a cleanup or anything like that, it might be hard to like just step into this movement and like start being an activist about it, because you have to understand the issue before you can care about it, and you have to care about it before you can really do anything about it. So I think the role of beach cleanups is really that, like, it's kind of like the open door to joining the movement, I guess.
Go, Dre.
Yeah, and I'll just add that it's like we were talking about earlier, it's a gateway drug, like Marissa saying, and it really is that first step. And I don't know if that wasn't an option for me when I was in college, and my only option was to testify at the legislature if I would have even gotten involved. So I really think that beach cleanups are a palatable first step for people, even though amongst ourselves we can kind of make fun of them as a band-aid, and we do make fun of them actively. I even have a friend who made a song about it that's like, yeah, beach cleanups don't do anything, sorry, you're not helping. But we all know that, but it is that gateway drug. It helps us grow our movement from the grassroots level, and it's a funnel, so we get way more people that way because people love going to the beach, and then they're able to see, because sometimes you can't actually see, like when I first went to Magic Island, you couldn't actually see what was in the rocks. You really have to get down and like get into the crevices of the rocks, and then you're like, endless amounts of plastic hidden, or the microplastics that you can't see if you're just walking. So I think it's really, really important to connect to the problems and the solutions through that as a first step.
Kahi, I'm going to jump over to you in just a second, but you brought up an interesting point, Dore. When I was in college, I was a marine science major in Miami, and about halfway through, I know you've heard this story, Dore, but I was so frustrated. I was like, why do I keep reading papers from the 1980s about climate change and coral bleaching and all of these issues, right? I was like, why aren't we doing something? I got involved in this because I wanted to change. And then I ended up at the Surfrider Club at the University of Miami. And the first thing we did, we were a fledgling club, and we hosted a beach cleanup, and only 2 people showed up, but it was the best beach cleanup I'd ever been to, and probably ever. Didn't have beer coffee, but it was, like you said, that action item. Like I finally felt, okay, I'm taking action. You make such a good point that, yeah, if people came and we're like, okay, now you have to go testify in front of the ledge, like, that is scary and very different versus, yeah, I'm going to be able to come out. So I like that you made that connection. All right, Kahi, I'm ready. What's the role of beach cleanups, the good and bad of beach cleanups? Give it to me.
Well, personally, for me, it was a beach cleanup that woke my ass up. So as part of paying it forward, I was like, okay, if that's what it took me to recognize the issue, which has now evolved to a continual path of education to learn more about the subject, what is it going to take others? So it's the cleanup. And ever since then, I was like, I want to give this experience to as many people as I can. And the trick is, how do you get that many people out there? People don't really feel like they're making as much of an impact if there's only 2 people that show up. But if you get 1,500 people, you don't feel like it's a Herculean task. You feel like there's other people like me. There are others out there, and I shouldn't give up. And the cleanup is just a really great experience to introduce the person, and then to be the hub for them to bring in other initiated people to also learn. Because we see so much recidivism in these cleanups. Like we see the same people year after year after year. And it's like, that this isn't the solution. And let's be honest, it's not the solution, but it is one of the most poignant solutions in the ability to wake people up. So even if we're not making a dent in actually cleaning up the mess because it's just going to be back, well, look at the amount of awareness that they create. It's priceless. And I think it's probably the most powerful tool that we have.
And I'm glad that, and I want to take that and then shift it just a little bit, because we wouldn't, again, of course, be in this issue of talking about cleanups if we didn't have such a consumer-based, throwaway-based society, right? And one of the things that I wanted to draw back to Hawaii is, they were talking in this documentary about, they were in India, and they were talking about, he said, we used to have respect for materials, but we've lost that. We used to not have any of this because all of our materials you didn't throw away, right? Everything was, it was a resource. And it got me thinking about here, right? And Hawaii, because as an island, there was a time, not so very long ago, when we weren't throwing things away, right? And especially speaking, and looking from that Native Hawaiian perspective as well. So, but today, and one of the tactics that the lobbyists had used against our polystyrene ban was don't take our plate lunch, right? And having this plate lunch packaged in styrofoam, and it was like, oh my gosh, if you take away the styrofoam, polystyrene packaging, you're taking away a piece of our culture. So wondering if you guys could all speak to that a little bit. And I did think, we are this place that is so tied to not wasting and not being wasteful, but have yet, is there a way we can get back to that? Or where do you sort of see that intersection with where we're at now?
I want to speak to this just because it triggers me when I think about that campaign, because it was like, you see this, and if they paid a local dude to hold up a styrofoam lunch, and it just said, don't take away my plate lunch. There's no logic, or it doesn't actually make sense. It's so ironic, and it's so offensive, because Hawaiian culture was zero waste, and there wasn't plastic, and plastic is such a new thing that the fact that that campaign was effective, I think, was the most shocking to me, because it was so clearly wrong and didn't add up. But how effective marketing is on our minds, I think, is really worth examining. That people are so easily swayed by a poster or a meme, and oftentimes we don't want to go through that process of critical thinking of like, one step would just take you to the conclusion that, oh, my plate lunch can be packaged in anything else other than styrofoam, like paper or compostables, or anything. And so I think that's what's concerning to me. And I think that's really what we're trying to cultivate, is this community of critical thinkers who care about things other than convenience. And I do think that ultimately we're winning, and that these lobbyist tactics are running really, really short. And we've been seeing that in the city council hearings and the state legislature, where in fact, even the politicians are starting to call out the lobbyists and saying, we're sick of your tactics, we're gonna do something this time around. And so that's been really inspiring. And I just wanna send a message out that, yeah, the lobbyist tricks, they're not gonna work anymore. Like we're done, you know, and we're gonna win. So that's why we want Bill 40, and we're gonna keep winning more.
Kahi or Marissa, would you like to speak to that as well? Just kind of this idea of like zero waste is sort of just central to our community. How can we get back there?
Yeah, I would kind of tag on to what Dure was saying about like how important framing is for these issues, and like how we define the problem and how we talk about or how we define the problem and how we frame the issue kind of determines how we talk about it and like how we argue about it. So if we let like industry and lobbyists frame the issue in a way that's beneficial to them, like we're never going to win the argument. So if the frame is like taking away plate lunch from like locals, then yeah, we're not gonna like, it's gonna be hard to like argue with it. But if we reframe the argument as that there's an alternative and that we can do things a different way and that we did do it a different way before styrofoam existed, then I think it's a lot easier to like have that conversation. And so yeah, I just wanted to touch on like the importance of that and like putting a frame on the issue that is beneficial to what we're arguing for. Industry and lobbies kind of determine that for us. And then also just kind of touching on, I'm not sure if I have this idea fully framed in my mind, but kind of tying in like social justice issues when we talk about like moving away from plastic pollution, because sometimes plastic is the cheapest option for communities who may not be as wealthy or who may not have access to the alternatives yet. So thinking about that and keeping that in mind when we're pushing for legislation and having options for providing alternatives to communities who may not be able to afford it. And just kind of like keeping that in mind is really important, because people who don't think that they have access to the alternatives will probably side with that argument of like opposing a change until they realize that the resources would be available to them. And yeah, I guess just like always keeping the diverse perspectives in mind when we're advocating for these things.
Absolutely. Thank you, Marissa. We just had a question come in, which is actually a question that I had on my list as well, and trying to figure out where to fit it in. So I guess we're going to fit it in right now. So Trissa was asking, and this discussion around COVID-19 and the CDC coming out with this statement, which hopefully you guys have seen and read, where essentially saying that single-use plastics are better, again, framing, shifting, driving the narrative, essentially, right? And this whole idea of almost in a way, I guess, kind of capitalizing on that fear of COVID-19 to say that we need to utilize single-use plastics more. So curious about your guys' thoughts on that and how, like I was showing you guys, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna get flack for this, but this is, you know, the trail mix we usually are able to get in bulk, and we're not allowed to bring bulk bags right now. And I've even snuck them in and gotten in trouble. And they're not even having this in bulk. It's already pre-packaged. And my husband was the one who went shopping, so we're going to have a talk about that later. But this is a major issue, right? And so all of the things that we used to buy, not packaged, not even talking about the single-use stuff that the CDC is really requiring us to use, or saying that we should utilize now, but all of these new requirements where we used to be able to utilize are reusable. So where, maybe Kahi, you can speak to that. So that's the last question, but where is this discussion around COVID-19? How is that impacting our use of reusables?
Well, I tend to like take whatever the government says with a bit of skeptical thinking. I'm seeing the CDC come out with these types of guidelines under the guise that, you know, who's really pulling the strings are the companies that make all of those single-use plastics and whatnot, pushing that narrative through the CDC because they currently have control over these types of organizations thanks to the existing administration in power. So we knew this was coming. We simply need to more or less get the data that we can trust that isn't tainted and be able to come back with a response. But in the short term, hey, as environmentalists, we don't want to come out and put anybody at risk from a health standpoint. Like in the end, we're telling people to stop using plastic because eventually it could kill us all from just pollution and ruining the oceans, and then the tragic dominoes that happen after that. So if right now we were to come out and say, don't listen to the CDC, it wouldn't be the greatest PR strategy for environmentalists to be advocating. So from my standpoint, it was more or less saw this coming. Let's allow time to go by and come back with a aligned response that more or less proves that this action is not based on science and based more on political motivations to reduce the environmental movement's power over things like plastics.
I'm glad you brought that up because that was the question that just came in from Shannon and saying, yeah, we've found so far that they're saying that the virus itself actually lives on plastics longer than it does other surfaces. And I saw DeRay, you unmuted. So did you want to follow up on that as well, or follow up on Kahi's points?
Yeah, I mean, just from the local perspective, so the city and county of Honolulu had kind of signaled that they were going to recommend all businesses use single-use plastics, especially in food establishments. And there was a contingent of us that were saying, no, this is not based in science, as Shannon mentioned, in the studies that have been done. And that reusables are completely safe, especially given that the Department of Health they already have such stringent standards on specific sanitation methods that all restaurants already follow. So reusables are completely safe and always have been from viruses because they're like sanitized in a 3-step system. And so we were able to deter the city from formally recommending single-use plastics, but there is definitely this industry lobby effort nationally, not just in the plastics industry, but a lot of other industries are trying to leverage this as a way to get regulations relieved. That we're seeing the fishing industry locally do that now to Trump to get rid of the marine protected areas we just won recently. So I think we need to be really cautious and aware of how much time and money these groups have. And they just, yeah, because of all the time and resources they have, they just spend all of that time like trying to reverse things that are good. And we're just trying to put out true factual information that we don't need to be afraid of reusables, and that there are disposable alternatives that are better than plastic already available.
Kahi, did you have another thought on that you were wanted to follow up with?
It was more in reference to that ad that the American Chemistry Council put out of the local guy with the styrofoam packaging, and it was like the biggest affront to the Hawaiian community that I could see. You know, like we're talking about arguably the most sustainable from an environmental standpoint culture ever to exist on Earth, and saying that the food is best served in the most unsustainable product around. Like, I'm really hoping that we can keep the momentum on Bill 40 and avoid any of this potential backlash towards the bill, because I was really looking forward. It's fun. I have a friend that's on right now from Australia, Cam, who really loves Wendy's, and I wanted to take him and show him that we can get food in non-plastic coated stuff. I was like, dude, we can do this in Hawaii. You can do it in Australia. I want to get him a plate lunch, but he really loves Wendy's.
I hope we can get Cam a sustainably sourced and packaged Wendy's meal when the coronavirus is lifted.
Okay.
You know, in talking about that, I kind of wanted to also pivot back to Marissa, you know, coming from the Youth Voice. I want to talk about the Youth Voice, but I also, before that, I did have a question, you know, for you, born and raised in Hawaii, taking the lessons that you've taken from here and taking them to California. What's that been like?
Yeah, I think like growing up on an island, you kind of see systems on a smaller scale, and you can see that like your resources all come from somewhere, and the stuff you use after you're done with it all has to go somewhere. And I think you think about it more when you're living on an island, because you have to like you kind of think about those things, you know, like, where's all our food coming from? There's not farms everywhere, like it must be coming from somewhere. And like, where's all our trash going? I don't see landfills everywhere, so like it must be going somewhere. So I think like growing up on the island, I thought about these things a lot more, and I thought about like the systems in place that are providing all of these things that I'm using and providing for all of the activities that I do and everything. And you grow up learning about ahupua'a, and you learn about the Hawaiian culture and how they could sustain a large population of people on these islands without needing to import all this food and without needing to export all this trash or burn it. And so taking those ideas with me when I left to go to college was really interesting, because I noticed that a lot of people didn't necessarily have that mindset or were aware of those things. A lot of people don't necessarily think about where their food comes from or where their trash goes. People don't even know what a watershed is. And so growing up in Hawaii, like that's something you think about all the time. Like people always talk to you about the connection between Mauka to Makai and the connections all around you, but people aren't always aware of that on the mainland, I think. And so it was really interesting, especially going into a major environmental management and protection, where I thought everyone would be aware of all these things, but they're not. And I think that kind of speaks to our education system too, and how people are being taught from a young age. Sometimes that information might be influenced by these, like the messages that industries are putting out and stuff too. And like there's not enough education on sustainability from a young age, I think. So that's just like a really interesting thing that I saw. And also just awareness of like indigenous cultures too. So like growing up in Hawaii, you learn about Hawaiian culture. I'm assuming in all schools. I learned a lot about it, and I took that knowledge with me, and I learned about the Chumash people on the San Luis Obispo coastline when I went to college. And I'm minoring in Indigenous studies, so I'm like invested in learning about these things, but I don't think that everyone is. And in several Indigenous studies classes I've taken, people like aren't even aware of the history of colonial oppression in our country. And I think that that's something really important for people to understand. And it ties into this issue really well too, because these systems that were created by colonists are still the systems that we live under today, and are what cause marginalization of different people and different communities. And it ties into the Black Lives Matter movement. It ties into plastic pollution. It ties into the oil industry. It ties into all of these different issues. And there's so much of an interconnectedness. And I think people need to be aware of that in order to really like understand all these issues.
Marissa, can you run for president in like 2030? Like, how old do you have to be? That was great. But I love what you said, because I think it also goes back to what we've been dealing with COVID-19 here in Hawaii, right? Is we know our food systems are broken. We know plastic pollution is an issue. We know that we have to have more localized systems. We know our parents, or your parents, and my husband are working within the utility, right? My husband works on the renewables. They've seen renewables increase because all of a sudden the hotels have come off the grid because the hotels aren't open, they're not running. But we import diesel, right, to run our electricity. So we know that all of these systems are broken and that we have to shift to these more localized systems. And we've talked and we talk and we talk about it. And it's not just here, it's everywhere. And so I feel like COVID-19 has forced us to actually take action to really try to be more localized, because we're realizing that it's not that it's not if, it's when. And I think it also comes back, this was something that was brought up in the documentary, but I think it also comes back to, again, to this whole plastic pollution, right? And to this issue of what's driving it and how it's all connected. So I'm glad that you brought that up. I don't know, Dre, I know you also have a strong, not that we want to get into food systems, but just localized systems, right? I feel your energy over there through Zoom, and I'm like, Dre's ready to say something. So
I just wanted to say one thing about colonial food, and I'm really glad Marissa put that into context in such an educated way. But just that indigenous food is packaged in things like banana leaves, and colonial food is packaged in plastic. And I think it's just really important to recognize and for us to disidentify ourselves from this colonial food system and economic system we've inherited, and really look to Hawaiian and indigenous cultures who didn't have waste, who don't even, I think someone told me once that the Hawaiian language doesn't even have a word for trash, right? And so it's so important for us to look to these cultures and learn from them, so that we don't get bought by this ad that says don't take away my plate lunch, and say that's not my plate lunch, that's not my styrofoam package, that's something that was pushed onto me by this culture that I didn't create myself. And how do we create a culture that is in alignment with our values and the vision we have for a sustainable future? So I think that's just really key.
Thanks, Dre. And I do think that's such an important point. And I want to kind of on that point pivot to this idea of extended producer, I almost wrote consumer, extended producer responsibility, because I think that is something that hasn't been in the general public's vernacular. And we were talking about this a little before we jumped on. You know, when I first got involved in the plastic pollution issue, I was like, okay, I'm going to be on the beach, I'm going to collect that, I'm going to pick it up. And then I met Kahi, and he's like, we're supposed to hold the companies responsible. And I was like, we can do that? That's like a thing. So I was wondering, Kahi, because you have been a part of even my journey into this, and this was brought up, but expand on this. Like, what does that look like? Because right now, consumers, I don't think a lot of people understand this, our recycling is taxpayer funded. Like, we're paying for all of this. We're all bearing the burden of these very large, very big multinational corporations, from what's on our beaches to how we're disposing of it. So I was wondering, Kahi, if you could speak a little more to what is extended producer responsibility, and not only what is it, how does it actually work? How do we actually, does it work? Can we implement it? What does that look like?
All right. Okay, so best to kind of talk in analogy terms. So EPR, extended producer responsibility, for example, is when a consumer were to go to a cash register with a candy bar and buy the candy bar, they're really buying the candy inside the wrapper. But from the producer standpoint, they're buying the whole thing. They're buying the packaging and the candy bar. So when we're done consuming the product, we get rid of the plastic waste and the company has already made their money. So once the transaction happens, they have no responsibility left with their product. Like they're done with it. And now that whole product is now the responsibility of the person that bought it, the consumer. So when they throw it away, you know, the person that pays for that, it's the taxpayer money to deal with the waste management. And it's also the environment that has to pay for it in a, you know, the plastic get into the oceans, the food chain, etc. So EPR is saying that the responsibility should extend beyond the register for the life of the product. And the product doesn't just include the consumable part, but also the packaging. So what we're trying to drive is that for there to be a sustainable future, we need to have companies exercise extended producer responsibility that has them remain responsible for their product for the entire life cycle of it, which then means that they design the end of the life of their product into it so that they can make sure that they recover that product and it doesn't end up in the waste bin or in the oceans, etc., because it's going to cost them more money to deal with it then than it is for them to just simply design an end of life situation that has that product either go into a compostable situation where it biodegrades fully, or they're able to recover it and make more of the product that they're making in the first place.
So are there like actual, because I feel like you've probably had these conversations, like examples of where this does work, or are we holding the Coca-Colas, the Pepsis, the Unilevers, are we holding them accountable right now? Or is that the next step we have to take?
We are not holding anybody accountable. There's like maybe a few of us that practice conscious consumerism, but it's not happening fast enough. And I really don't think that we can have a consumer-led revolution. I have a little more hope right now. But talk to me like a couple of months ago, I'd say there's like a consumer-led revolution to plastics isn't going to happen. I really think what needs to happen is utilize capitalism to affect environmental change, where it's, if we can figure out how we can prove to these businesses that it's more lucrative to save the oceans than to destroy them, then those companies are going to be like, I want to be first to market with a product that is not going to hurt the oceans. I'm going to make my entire marketing strategy focused on a perfectly designed product that a consumer can have zero guilt in purchasing and actually almost feel like they're giving back to the environment by purchasing it. So then it becomes a corporate-led change, and then also it makes it easier for the consumer to buy in. So it's like a meritage of consumer-led and hey, this is Zozan Feli, everybody. So this is the future. So it's really about consumer-led change, but it's even more about corporate-led change. Honey, Daddy's on a Zoom call. Say hi really quick, and then you gotta go. Say hi.
Hi, Zo.
Okay, gotta go. I'll be out in a little bit and we'll play. So where were we? EPR, right? What was the question? See, she always makes me lose my thought. She like jumps into these meetings. I can't lock my door. So sorry about that.
No, that was good. No, and actually it was what you were saying was making me think about even just the pressure that we can apply. At UH Maui College, they're going plastic free, and they told, it was Dasani, I think Dasani is owned by Coca-Cola. Yeah, am I thinking about that right? And they said, we cannot have plastic bottles because we're going plastic free. And they're like, no can. And they're like, no, well, then we're not going to buy from you. And they actually turned out that they are now at the UH Maui College campus, you can buy a canned water, like in a tin can. So showing that even just the college level was able, with their buying power, to demand a shift and a change into something that, like, I haven't seen a can of water. So it is interesting, like you said, a couple months ago, you weren't not encouraged by consumer-led revolution, but I like that. I wrote that down. I'm going to put that above my bed tonight, consumer-led revolution. Did you have more thoughts on that, Kahi?
Well, one of the main reasons I work for Parlay for the Oceans now is because I recognize the importance of EPR, circular economies, and eliminating planned obsolescence. So I think that like we have to tackle these issues from all different types of angles. And for me personally, my focus is with the corporations.
Oh, Marissa.
I was just gonna say, when thinking about like extended producer responsibility, it's interesting, Kahi kind of touched on this, but basically the only way that these big corporations are making a significant profit off of like making these plastic products is through capitalizing on externalities. So like they're placing the cost of the environmental and social costs of these products onto other people rather than taking responsibility for it themselves. And that's what's causing marginalized communities to bear the biggest burden of these products and allowing these companies to make such a big profit. And so making them responsible for the pollution that they're causing could help solve some of these problems. And you can kind of see at least like a start to those solutions in other pollution areas. So if you look at like carbon taxes, and carbon trading systems, that's like a really interesting way to think about like market-based incentives for making producers responsible for the pollution that they're causing and making it like in order to maximize their profit under with carbon taxing on them, it's actually better for them to do something better for the environment so that they don't have to pay the price of the pollution that they're creating. And so I think that there's like some really cool opportunities in terms of making producers more responsible for the pollution that they're creating, and pushing for that and having consumers lead a revolution towards that is really like empowering to think about, because sometimes these problems are pretty like daunting and overwhelming, and individuals don't feel like they can really do anything about them because corporations have so much control.
I'm glad you brought that up, because when you look at like a plastic water bottle, it may be way cheaper than a glass bottle, right? But when you add in all the externalities to the impacts, environmental impacts, social impacts, health impacts of that plastic bottle, maybe that plastic bottle, one bottle of water should be $20 instead of $1. Duray, take it away.
I just wanted to share from the solution side that I think it's Germany and several other European countries that do charge, or they have like how we have our high five program in Hawaii, they have a 25-cent buyback. I mean, it varies from place to place, but this was featured in a documentary I saw recently. And the 25-cent buyback works by returning your bottles back to the grocery store, where there's like a vending machine where you return the bottle and you end up getting like cash. Because if you have, you can get $5. Now I'm going to test my own math. You can get $5 for 20 bottles. And so that adds up much more quickly than a 5-cent program would. And the company is responsible for taking those items back. They have to be the recycler and the processor. So that burden doesn't fall upon a third party or the municipality. And it's not vulnerable to the risks of the market, which is why we're seeing our recycling industry collapse globally, is because the market has been so volatile for so many years. And so I think that's where we need to move towards, is say, we don't care about the pressures we're receiving to say EPR is not feasible, because it works in Europe and many countries. And California is taking the lead on proposing a law that would put a 1 cent tax or 1 cent fee on every plastic packaged item. I think the caveat is that it's on items that are not recyclable or compostable. And then that money would go towards supporting new zero waste programs so that we can have more of a circular economy. So we're hopeful that that will pass, given that California tends to be the pioneer for these kinds of things. And we'll be looking to them for more guidance on EPR. So it's possible. I mean, I think America's a little bit behind compared to some of those more progressive countries, but yeah, I mean, they need to take responsibility. And I always use the analogy of the milkman model. And it's really like the milkman who dropped off your milk picks it back up. It's really that simple. They all did it back in the day. There's no reason they can't do it today, except that they don't want to spend more money. But when you're making billions upon billions of dollars in profit, there's a point where you're just being too greedy and you need to give back to some of the problems that you're causing.
Ahi, you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I can chime in quickly. It's like, yeah, they are making billions and billions and billions of dollars, but there's never going to be a altruistic bone coming out of them to stop that flow of money. It's really going to come from being forced from from governments to make that change, or the consumer. So long as we have this economy based on shareholder returns, that we're going to be stuck in this cycle. We can't expect them to do it out of the good of their heart. It's got to be forced upon them by shareholders, the consumers, or governments, or all of us all at once. So in the end, it really comes down to where the money's coming from, and where you're spending your money, and where you're investing your money. So I wish that corporations were altruistic and had feelings, because according to our government, corporations are people. So you would think they would have feelings, but they don't seem to.
They're people without hearts. But I guess I will add that I think what Marissa was pointing to about the carbon tax is so important, because plastic is made from oil, and oil is incredibly cheap, partly because it's heavily subsidized by the US government. So when you remove all of these corrupt factors, we can actually get to a place where oil is as expensive as it should be to account for the externalities, like the social and environmental externalities. And then plastic wouldn't be competitive anymore on the market as a packaging option. And I think we really need to grapple with that reality, not only in the terms of plastic, but also in the food industry, and how the food industry, the junk food industry and the meat industry are the ones that are heavily subsidized by government. So it's the same issue it's the same corruption in every issue you face. So it's always back to the money, and how the government controls the market in the wrong way. And if they control the market in the right way, we can really get to some positive solutions.
And that's why I'm thankful for these silver linings that we've started to see with COVID-19, right? And again, that shift back to our localized systems, back potentially to the milkman, back to our local farmers, and investing in our local systems, because that right there is going to cut down a lot. But I'm glad I actually had that written, our subsidies. So I'm glad that you guys have touched on that. And with 9 minutes to go, I hope that everyone is tuned in. Again, I think everyone who's tuned in is probably already a part of this conversation, understands this issue of plastic, but I hope what this conversation has done is taken it from the straw bans, which we know it's all tied in, like it's important, but taking it to that next level, right? Where this is much bigger than straws. This is a much bigger issue with a lot of different factors. And in saying that, then it kind of gets back even to Marissa's point of, now I'm overwhelmed, So I guess in these last couple of minutes we have just each of you guys sharing. I did write down vote, because I think we all do need to vote and shift who's in office and representing us, especially at that federal level, and representing interest versus the rest of us. And but yeah, what not that you have to put a nice shiny like bow on it, you can be honest with us, but what do we need to do? What are some things that we can do? What are the avenues so we can try to really address this in a meaningful way? And I'm going to go Kahi, Marissa, then Duray, because that's who I'm seeing on my screen in that order.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah, you can hear me. I'm personally extremely disenfranchised with our entire political system. My man got screwed 2 election cycles in a row. So I don't like Democrat, Republican, you know, they're all being powered by the same corporations, and it's just heart-wrenching when we finally had a chance to really unveil that and see real change from a top-down level. Most of that is lost. So I have to say, like, we should never be having to choose between the lesser of 2 evils. And I didn't realize we were going to be talking about this, but like, in all honesty, right now, I'm like, we need to hit. We're like drug addicts. Like, we have to hit like super rock bottom before we wake the hell up, and that's where we're headed. And like, I wish I could give some silver linings and some glimmer of hope, but like, I don't, from a political standpoint, I don't see much. And like, it's just, I don't know. I hope maybe the rest of you can bring me some hope, and not the hope in the form of that, hey, some of these people that we do like are going to be on some committees where they're going to be more or less have gags put on them still. So I will leave it at that, except, okay, I do have some hope, right? And
I was gonna say, I shouldn't have said the word vote. Maybe you can take that piece out.
But no, I still think we should vote. You know, we shouldn't be forced to vote blue no matter who. But we also should have to understand the ramifications of our choice of how we vote in this upcoming election. And maybe we do need to hit extreme rock bottom and whatnot. But I see hope. I do see hope in things like what's happening right now with the Black Lives Matter movement. And I've actually had online conversations with people, and I've been able to actually convince them, like, we're talking about staunch far right leaning ideals that I've been able to, like, at least kind of get people to start to understand the perspective of being a person of color, and understanding, like, how I can help them contextualize their place on earth as a white person or even a mixed person. And the hope I'm seeing is I see people actually starting to have the introspection needed for us to get towards change. And I think that's extremely hopeful. Like, I would have never thought I'd be able to get through to some of these people, but right now they're listening. They're starting to see that this house of cards that they've built up is really not really with a strong foundation, and it's crumbling, and it's as a result of their strength in their beliefs. And now that it's all breaking down, they're like, wow, maybe what I believed was wrong. And at the same time, I'm seeing things like, hey, I didn't see that perspective. Like, we all have to realize, like, the more information we get, our ideals can change, and the way that we view needs to continue to evolve. So that gives me hope.
I like that. I think you totally hit it. I think people are so much more open right now to receiving, even people who thought they were already there and realizing we're not there, right? And I do think the plastic pollution issue, it is also a very personal journey, right? Like, it does happen on an individual level. We've got to realize that, and it's opening yourself up to looking at your lifestyle, not just with plastic, but it's like, do I really need that new shirt? Do I really need this? It's like going back to that consumerism too, right? So I agree, Kahi. I think that people are much more open and receptive. I'm glad that you brought that up. Marissa, what's your hope? What can we do?
Yeah, I like what Kahi was saying. I also would just add on, like kind of just what we're seeing with this whole Black Lives Matter movement, and how many people are showing their willingness to listen at this time and to do something about it, and to, like, accept that maybe they don't know everything, but that it's time to start listening and to learn what they haven't been aware of this whole time, and to become aware of those things, and to reflect. And I feel like COVID, on top of all of this, like all of the racial injustice issues that are at the forefront of the news and everything right now, they're both providing opportunities for us to reflect and really think about what our role is in our communities and in the world, and how we're living our lives. And I think that for me, hope really comes from like just the conversations that I have with other people, and like always being able to like keep our minds open to like learning new things. I think that educating ourselves and each other is a really important like first step to making change happen, because if people don't know what's going on and don't know what they can do, then nothing's going to happen. But once we start having the hard conversations and start listening to maybe voices that we haven't been listening to, I think that's where change can start to happen. And I would also say, this is something that Doshi always says from Algalita. He was in the film. He always says we should be welcoming people in and not calling them out. And I think that that's something to keep in mind always too, is that like we're all at different places of understanding of this issue, of racial injustice issues, of any issues. We all are at different like points of, we're all at different levels of understanding. And so recognizing that and not calling people out for not knowing enough, but calling them in and educating them and welcoming them in and having conversations with them and letting them know that they're an important part of the movement too, because we need diverse people involved, and we need everyone's voice, and we need entire communities to be on board in order to like make actual change happen. So I think that that's a really important thing to keep in mind.
Thank you, Marissa. And Duray, what's your hope? Where do we go from here?
I would say that there are so many of us who want the same thing. Like there's enough of us who want the same thing that we can achieve it. And we just have to organize around that shared vision. And I do really feel like 2020 has been crazy. I mean, this year is going to go down in history, no question about it. And the fact that we started out with COVID-19, with this global reset, most of my friends are unemployed at home, you know, taking in information. And then this racial justice movement has popped up at a time when everyone is at home, looking at their phone, watching these videos, reading the news. And I really feel like it's connected. That's really what sparked this movement. I've lived in Hawaii for 10 years, and historically I've saw an average of 300 people show up to any demonstration. And the fact that we had 10,000 people show up on Saturday in Honolulu is, I mean, it's insane. And so I really feel like we're at a moment where, regardless of whether we can see the final sustainable world, that we're at a place where we've hit like this peak awareness. And maybe we're not at peak awareness necessarily, but we're at like a peak openness to discomfort. And people are so pained and uncomfortable with what's happening that they're like humbled. And I think that in itself is such a good place for us to start talking to each other, organizing, sharing, social media, like all these things. And so I don't know where kind of we end up, but I do know like this is an incredible opportunity to reset our consciousness and reconnect with each other in a way that can be more radical and progressive, because we need to move fairly quickly to solve our global problems. So that's my perspective.
I love it. And, you know, we are just on time, and I really appreciate, I want to say, I think this has been, this conversation and where we've gone, all the places over the last hour and a half have probably been one of the most insightful, meaningful conversations I've gotten to have about plastic pollution. And the fact that we were able to have this on Zoom and connect with probably more people than we could have, and now it's going to live forever, and people can watch it over and over, I think also just goes to the fact that we're able to do things now that we wouldn't have thought about doing, you know, 3 months ago, 4 months ago. You guys are all amazing. And again, I really appreciate the opportunity to seriously dive into some of these issues that aren't talked about in the plastic pollution movement as much as they should be. And I hope actually in like 3 or 6 months, we can all check back in and do this again and see like where we're at. Did anything shift? Because Kahi's like, if we're at, when we get to rock bottom, I'm like, I feel like we are at rock bottom right now. So I hope we don't add too much further to go. But it would be really neat to check back in and see what our perspectives are, our 6 months down the road selves. Like if we could look back and wish we had told ourselves this, but just very thankful for all of you, all of your insights. And Dore, I don't know if you want any last words to wrap it up just from the Oahu chapter, because you guys worked hard to put this on.
I would just defer to Kahi, follow Kahi on TikTok at Plastic Surf, because apparently he's dancing and that sounds fun. But we're at Surfrider Oahu. So please join us, Sustainable Coastlines Hawaii. Anything happening locally in your community, it's all hands on deck for all of these important issues. So just get involved any way you can.
Okay, mahalo guys, take care, be safe, continue. What are we doing tonight, everyone? We're consumer-led revolution. Just dream about that. Okay, bye-bye, take care.
Thank you.
Thank you guys.